Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Hello, welcome everybody. This is Gunter back with another episode of Inspired Change. So in this particular episode, I'm going to have a little bit of a rant, essentially because at the present time there's lots of things to actually rant about. But one of the things that's been really sort of getting underneath my skin is when I look around and listen to people and read in the social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever other medium people are trying to use, stuff that influences people's emotions and behaviour. And a lot of that, as Shakespeare says in Hamlet, is that things are neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. So why am I on about this? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, one of the things that appears to be rather uncommon at the present time is the capacity to really critically think about stuff. Now, lots of people think, but whether it's actually critical thinking remains to be seen. The other aspect is that for most of us, a large part of our emotional experience is actually a direct result of beliefs that we have at a sort of medium to deeper level in our psyche. As I said, Shakespeare has Hamlet say in one of the soliloquies, "Things are neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so." So let's unpack that for a bit. In this particular episode, I want to focus more on the idea of what critical thinking is and how we can apply that whole process to creating a better understanding of ourselves, our society, and the experiences that we have in this society with the events that are currently going on. Now, in making good men great, I'm going to propose that one of the elements of moving from good to great is the capacity for me to be self-aware, to be able. If we're going to aspire to living a great life, then we have no choice but to take up Socrates' words and actually put them into practice. Now that means, again, sitting back and being able to reflect on what it is that I'm thinking and how I'm thinking about things. So as I was preparing for the podcast, I had a look around the internet to sort of see what's available. And I ran across a really interesting article by Paul Ratner on how to think effectively and to look at 6 stages of critical thinking. Now, I always like a little bit of a framework and stages and phases, and so it just helps me create a framework from which I can build. And so Ratner describes the work of Linda Elder and Richard Paul, 2 educational psychologists who put together a 6-stage model for critical thinking. Now, this could possibly invoke some criticism and possibly some critique, which is fine. These things probably need to be thought about just as critically as we think about why it is that I might be acting morally, ethically, or immorally and unethically. So the whole thing at the moment about critical thinking in the current landscape is that we're absolutely inundated with a whole range of theories, most of which have absolutely no basis in fact or reality, but are really based on conspiracy theories. And I, in another episode, want to talk about what actually leads people into buying into conspiracy theories. Okay, but in this particular instance, I want to give you an overview of the stages of critical thinking. So stage one fundamentally is the unreflective thinker. So remember, I talked about reflection as being an important part of critical thinking. So people in that situation, in that stage, don't think about how they form opinions and what they base their decisions on. They simply come about from prejudices and misconceptions, while their thinking doesn't really improve in quality. So they're not necessarily interested in accuracy, relevance, precision, and logic in a consistent way. Now, one of the aspects in education is that part of what helps us to think critically is to acquire knowledge. Not opinion, knowledge. And that it needs to be logical, it needs to be factual, and it needs to be objective. Okay? So that's the stage one thinker, is the unreflective thinker. Stage two is the challenged thinker. So this particular thinker has awareness of the importance of thinking on their existence, and knowing the deficiencies in thinking can bring about major issues. So, for example, when I work as a therapist, the only reason why I can help people, not the only reason, but one of the main ones, when people come to me, is that they have admitted that they have a problem that needs to be solved in some way or another. So, in other words, to solve a problem, you must first admit that you've got one. And so high quality thinking is now starting to formulate. It actually, the person begins to understand that it requires deliberate reflective thinking about thinking. In psychology, we talk about metacognition. The other part to this is that at that stage, a lot of people come to understand that their actual mental processes could be quite flawed. And in another episode, I'll talk about rational versus irrational beliefs and how they affect us emotionally. So the challenged thinker has a sense that thinking involves navigating assumptions and inferences and points of view, but they only do that at the initial level. They don't get any deeper. In stage three, which is the beginning thinker, they go beyond the first two stages. They now know that their own thinking is capable of having biases and blind spots. But again, this thinking at this stage is still only in its infancy. Beginning thinkers often place more value on reasoning, becoming self-aware in their thoughts. They might also be looking at concepts and biases underlying their ideas. So in that phase, in that stage, the thinker begins to develop a higher internal standard of clarity, accuracy, and logic. They also appreciate that their ego's got a major stakeholding in the role of their decisions. At this stage, the thinker also has the ability to take criticism of their mental approach, even though it still requires some work. Now, we'll move on to stage 4, which is what they refer to as the practicing thinker. So not only does this particular thinker appreciate their own deficiency, but they have skills to deal with them. A thinker at this level will practice better thinking habits and analyse their mental processes with regularity. So reflection becomes an intention that's practiced consistently and persistently, which are key elements in what I see makes us resilient. The problem is that practicing thinkers might still not have a systematic way of gaining insight into their thoughts, and they can fall prey to their own defense mechanisms and their own egocentric and self-deceptive reasoning. And I'm seeing that constantly in the situation with the coronavirus. So stage 5, which is the advanced thinker, does a couple of things very differently. This high-level thinker has strong habits. Okay, number 1. Now, those habits are about analysing their thinking that creates insight about different areas of life. So, for example, one of the things that I frequently do with people in my practice is I help them to look at how they're functioning at work and how they're functioning in their private life and whether that aligns or not. The advanced thinker is also at ease with self-critique and generally does that systematically. The driver is to improve. And it's that stage that often leads the men that I work with to going from good to great. They're looking for intellectual insight and emotional understanding. They're looking for intellectual integrity, and they're looking to broaden a sense of empathy. And at this stage, it's still intellectual. Empathy comes in 2 phases. Firstly, intellectual empathy, which is I can intellectually understand what is happening to somebody, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm emotionally empathic. That is, I can feel what it is that the other person's feeling. The other aspect here in the advanced thinker is what's referred to as intellectual courage, and that is that we confront ideas and beliefs that I'm not necessarily invested in. Okay, so as the advanced thinker, I can play around with ideas, but not necessarily base everything on. Now, stage 6, which is the master thinker. And this is the person, the thinker, who is totally in control of how they process information and make decisions. People like that constantly want to improve their thought skills and through experience regularly raise their thinking to the level of conscious realization, so that the insights that are achieved here are at a deeper level. And there's an ethical and moral component to that as well. And that is that I'm going to experience equity and fairness, and I'm particularly interested in getting over my own egocentricity. At this level, I'm also going to make sure that I've got a high level of practical knowledge and insight, and that I constantly re-examine my assumptions for weaknesses, logic, and biases. Now, the master thinker also doesn't get too upset with being intellectually challenged, and will absolutely reflect on their own reaction or response to that challenge. Now, this is a framework which I think is actually really, really useful, and we can apply this particularly at this stage of the game with things like the coronavirus, the necessary changes about climate change. Not only does this level of critical thinking, that is, the more advanced levels of the practicing advanced and master thinker, can really help to give us a much better understanding about what my individual, family, social, and ecological needs are and what needs to be changed. The problem is that not everyone plays on the same level. And so we're going to have tensions and conflicts that are going to arise from this. And the main question around this is, how do we, at the higher level of thinking, deal with those that aren't there? Because we can't just criticise them. You know, we need to give people an opportunity to move, to evolve. And for that, we need some emotional skills like patience, some compassion, and some tolerance. So having looked at the 6 stages of critical thinking, I want to challenge each and every one of you listening to this podcast to think about where you might be at. And there's no shame in being at the lower levels. It's the insight in going, oh, I think I'm more here than there. What it means is then having the courage to step it up, to go to another level, to apply myself to acquiring knowledge, to acquiring awareness, to really being able to apply the knowledge that I have and how I understand it to a critical analysis, and then to be able to evaluate that appropriately. So until next time, have fun with this. Remember, put your ego in your pocket. Those of us who are slightly narcissistic in our temperament might think we're really at the top, when in fact we're not. So hubris has very little place in this. And until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you, Gunter. And thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.